Welcome to the grid at the start of the Donington 4-hour GT race. Now, I know you don't think I work very hard on Top Gear, but boy, is 1 hour in this Jaguar going to be hard work. I'd qualified the XJ220 7th behind a posse of McLaren F1 GTRs, the racing version of the car I tested on Top Gear last year. Gordon Murray's supercar created a sensation with its central driving position and astonishing performance. 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds, top speed of 231 miles an hour. It's still a road car that rolls a bit on its relatively soft suspension, but with 627 horsepower, it's fantastic fun. This is sensational. The race car has dominated GT racing this year, winning each of the 5 rounds before Donington, with 4 of those victories going to the #1 Gulf car driven by Ray Belm and Maurizio Sala. At Donington, they'd been out-qualified by John Nielsen in the white East car and by Andy Wallace in the yellow Harrods example, and the 3 of them sprinted away into an early lead, followed by a pack of Porsches, 2 Jaguars, 2 Corvettes, a Lotus and a Marcus. The GTR McLaren F1s have just 20 horsepower more than the road cars, with a regulation air restrictor limiting the output, while the potential top speed is reduced to 210 miles an hour by the drag of the racing wing. The interior is stripped, there's extra cooling for the brakes, and of course there are racing tyres. Suspension is stiffer, and there's a lot of development being done with the shock absorbers to fine-tune the balance of the chassis. Behind the McLarens and just in front of me, the fastest Porsche from the Labra team that had beaten me in China. Bob Wallach, though, was out of luck today, stopping after just 20 minutes with a broken gear selector. And on the rear-engined 911, that was out of reach of the mechanics and the car was out of the race. In the early laps, the 5 McLarens led. John Nielsen from Andy Wallace, then Ray Belm, his teammate Pierre-Henri Raffanel and Fabien Giroir. The first to falter was Ray Belm. Broken splines on a gear selector shaft meant a long stop and a lowly finish. We hope for better reliability in the Jaguar, already a proven GT winner at Le Mans. I tested that car at Silverstone 2 years ago after it had lost its Le Mans win due to a technical infringement. I'd found the factory-backed TWR-built machine to be a really well-sorted racing car and a delight to drive. But now, with larger intake restrictors that allow a lot more power than then, the tyres and chassis of my current car are being stressed far harder. That same day, I also tested the '93 Le Mans Lotus Esprit. Both cars entered had dropped out of the race, a feat they unfortunately repeated last year. But at Donington, the new factory-run team were running strongly, having qualified just behind me, and they looked set to win their class. Before the first hour was over, I was heading for the pit early, with tired tyres and fluctuating fuel pressure. I hoped that a full tank would solve the problem as I handed over the driving duties to Richard Piper. Pickup, that's why I thought we'd fill it up and send him out. I told him. But hopefully, no, we'll just have to stop early. Not too bad a stint because the rear tyres went off after 5. That's a big heavy car, and the problem is it's got a locked rear differential, so around the hairpins, both wheels have been wearing the tyres out. But then we had a fuel pressure problem halfway through the stint, so I think it's been 30 minutes build up to see if that cures it, but otherwise it's fine. The other Jaguar XJ220 was suffering fewer dramas, a welcome change for team manager Hugh Chamberlain, who used to run the unreliable Lotus Esprits. They were several laps down on the leaders, but soldiered on to finish 8th. Richard Piper and I were less fortunate. 30 minutes into his stint, Richard was back in the garage for good, explaining the problem to team owner Tony Brooks and team manager Bob Skeen. Well, I thought it was a fuel pressure problem, and there was a fuel pressure problem, and then it was all going fine again, and then there's a gearbox problem, and we're not racing anymore. And it's not a 4-hour race, it's a 1.5-hour race, so we'll go home now and we'll get it right for Le Mans. Bye-bye. For the rest of the field, there was still plenty of work to be done, and with John Nielsen in the pits for fuel, Andy Wallace had taken the lead in the yellow Harrods car that he was sharing with Derek Bell's son Justin. As Nielsen exited the pits in the car he shares with its owner, Thomas Boucher, it was Wallace's turn to head in and refuel. With no other work on the car being allowed during refueling, the tactic is to make the driver and tyres last 2 stints. So Andy stayed on board, took care to obey the pit lane speed limit, and got out just in front of John Nielsen. The battle resumed. Once the second Gulf car had stopped, the 2 Dave Price-run cars were disputing the lead, and a fair old tussle it turned out to be until Andy Wallace came up to lap a back marker. He left his braking a little too late and got clobbered by the Porsche. Now, have you ever heard of a racing driver who blamed himself when it was not his fault?
Coming into the chicane, I don't know, I guess about 15 laps into the second stint, I just locked up the rear of the car, and as I did that, the car just went sideways enough to knock the right rear against one of Conrad's cars with Bird driving, and it was my fault.
Andy limped round to the pits with a broken track roll end, and the repair cost 3 laps, but they would recover to finish third. With 2 McLarens now delayed, the third quarter of the race saw the blue Jacquardine car, driven by former Grand Prix driver Olivier Grouillard, take the lead, as the gentleman owners in the Gulf and East cars did their stints. And Nielsen stalked the pit lane like an expectant father, ready to take over for a final charge on a fresh set of tyres. By now, Grouillard had more than a minute's lead, but speeding in the pit lane cost him a 10-second stop-go penalty in the sin bin. And then he did it again. But the 4-minute penalty for this second offence meant the car's late transmission failure had not cost him the race. That should have put the Lotus into 4th place overall, but the excellent run by Alessandro Zanardi and Alex Portman ended with another transmission failure. Cruel reward for an excellent effort. And so the East McLaren came home 80 seconds ahead of Pierre-Henri Raffanel and Lindsay Owen-Jones in the Gulf car, and 3 laps up on Wallace and Bell. A great win for John Nielsen and Thomas Boucher, and another clean sweep for the McLaren F1. But will they last the distance at Le Mans?